Late autumn, 1944. A thin mist hangs over the wire of a U.S. POW camp in the American Midwest, settling on the cold metal like frost. Inside the compound, a group of newly arrived female prisoners, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries from collapsed German units, huddle in their heavy coats. Boots crunch on gravel, an engine growls. A U.S. Army truck rolls past the gate, and at the wheel sits a young American woman in uniform, hands steady on the rim, eyes forward. The prisoners stare in silence, unable to reconcile the scene before them with everything they had been taught. Nowhere was that assumption stronger than inside the Axis powers. In Nazi Germany, the ruling ideology pushed a narrow vision known as Kinder, Küche, Kirche. Children, kitchen, church. The regime encouraged women to raise families and support the nation through motherhood, not through military or industrial labor. By 1939, German women certainly worked in factories and offices, but the state resisted expanding their roles into the core machinery of war. Driving trucks, managing transport lines, or working around armored vehicles remained domains firmly reserved for men. In Italy, traditions of masculinity and hierarchy shaped similar expectations. Women served mostly in nursing, clerical assistance, or local civil defense roles. Imperial Japan maintained even stricter divisions, expecting women to remain within domestic spheres unless catastrophe forced otherwise. Against this landscape, the United States appeared both familiar and different. American society in the 1930s was still conservative in gender norms, yet millions of women were already active in city offices, rural farms, textile mills, and industrial plants. They worked as typists, bookkeepers, drivers in rural communities, and factory laborers in sectors like food production or textiles. Still, even in America, the idea of women operating heavy machinery or taking on military-adjacent roles seemed improbable to most citizens on the eve of war. Then came December 7, 1941. With millions of American men pulled into the armed forces, the U.S. confronted a logistical crisis unlike anything in its history. The Army needed drivers, clerks, radio operators, mechanics, and logisticians. The factories needed millions of workers to produce trucks, jeeps, aircraft, and tanks. Every institution, civilian and military, felt the pressure. It was this pressure that began reshaping the boundaries of who belonged inside the machinery of war, setting the United States on a path the Axis prisoners would later witness with disbelief. America's response to its manpower crisis unfolded with unusual speed and scale. In early 1942, the U.S. Army created the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WAAC, marking the first time in American history that women were formally recruited to serve with the Army, though not yet in it. By 1943, the program proved so essential that Congress converted it into the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, granting women full military status. From that point forward, American women stepped into roles that reshaped the nation's war effort. They operated switchboards, managed warehouses, drove jeeps and trucks on sprawling bases, handled administrative operations for entire divisions, repaired vehicles, and coordinated supply chains stretching across continents. Their presence freed tens of thousands of male soldiers for combat duty, strengthening the U.S. Army's ability to project power across both the European and Pacific theaters. Beyond the Army, every branch of the U.S. military established its own women's service organizations. The Navy created the Waves, the Coast Guard launched the Spars, the Marine Corps formed the Women's Reserve. In the skies, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP, ferried newly built aircraft across the country, tested repaired planes, and performed essential non-combat flight duties in an era when aviation was still seen as one of the most technical fields in existence. Meanwhile, American industry mobilized on a scale the world had never seen. Millions of women flooded into factories, producing trucks, jeeps, artillery, aircraft, and tanks. In several testing grounds and assembly plants, women even drove tanks short distances, moved armored vehicles between workshops, or tested engines before delivery. Tasks unimaginable in many Axis nations. By 1944, the United States had mobilized nearly every layer of its society. Women wore uniforms. Women carried responsibility. Women sat behind steering wheels, gear levers, and engine panels once reserved exclusively for men. And it was at this moment, as the Allies advanced through Europe and thousands of Axis prisoners were moved into U.S. custody, that female POWs began encountering a reality their own governments had never prepared them to see. For many of the captured women, German Red Cross nurses, Luftwaffe clerks, auxiliaries from signals units, their first exposure to American women in uniform came as a jolt. They had marched through bombed towns, surrendered to advancing Allied troops, and crossed the ocean in guarded transports. Yet nothing unsettled their expectations quite like the sight of women performing military duties once thought unthinkable. In their world, a uniform signified male authority. A military vehicle symbolized discipline, force, and state power. Seeing a woman behind the wheel of a U.S. Army truck disrupted years of cultural conditioning in a single instant. Behind that shock lay simple wartime mathematics. The U.S. military depended on logistics more than any other force in the conflict. Every American infantryman, every pilot, every artillery crew relied on a constant flow of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment. Trucks were the arteries of the Allied war machine. To keep those trucks moving, the Army needed drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and clerks in unimaginable numbers. Women filled these roles because the war demanded it. The choice was not ideological but practical, and the system worked. This clash of expectations went far deeper than uniforms. Axis propaganda had painted American society as careless, chaotic, or morally weak. Yet inside the camps, female POWs saw something else entirely. A nation willing to reorganize itself, rethink its gender roles, and mobilize every available citizen to win the war. The message was subtle but powerful. If American women could serve in motor transport units, decode messages, work in logistics hubs, and handle machines, then the enemy they had imagined was not the enemy they now observed. And these observations only sharpened as their days in captivity unfolded. The shock felt by Axis women was inseparable from the immense industrial power behind it. In the United States, entire cities had been reshaped into war factories. Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and Pittsburgh roared with round-the-clock production. Women assembled engines, inspected transmissions, and worked on vehicle lines that produced thousands of trucks and tanks each month. On proving grounds in places like Aberdeen and Willow Run, women moved armored vehicles between workshops, tested engines, and drove newly finished machines across short evaluation tracks. These were not combat operations, but they demonstrated a technological confidence rare in the world at that time, a belief that anyone trained properly could handle the machinery of war. For American women themselves, these roles carried their own weight. Many had grown up on farms or in crowded cities, far removed from military life. Yet the urgency of war placed them beside engines, supply convoys, and administrative hubs that supported entire armies overseas. They worked long hours, learned new skills quickly, and discovered a sense of purpose that contradicted pre-war limitations. Female POWs watching them often measured this against their own experiences. Years of state messaging about women's responsibilities, women's strengths, and women's supposed limits. Captivity offered unwanted time to think, and many confronted the silent question: why had they never been allowed such responsibility? This contrast between expectation and reality cut into the foundations of Axis ideology. If a society could function, even thrive, with women handling machinery, logistics, and technical duties, then the rigid visions promoted back home were not universal truths, but political constructs. POW camps did not intend to teach ideological lessons, yet daily routines did exactly that. Machines moved, supplies arrived, women kept them running, and soon, these realizations would collide with a specific series of encounters that left a deeper, lasting imprint. By late 1944, the war had shifted decisively against the Axis. Across France and the Low Countries, the Allies pushed steadily eastward. German units collapsed, supply lines broke, and entire formations surrendered by the thousands. Among them were women from auxiliary branches, communication specialists, clerks, and Red Cross workers, gathered and processed by American forces before being transported to long-term camps in the United States. One such convoy arrived at a large Midwestern POW camp near the end of the year. The prisoners, exhausted from weeks of retreat and capture, stepped through the gate expecting the grim routines familiar to wartime detention. Male guards, male personnel, male authority at every turn. But the Americans who ran this camp operated under a very different logistical structure, one shaped by necessity and by the massive mobilization at home. Within minutes of arrival, the new prisoners experienced a moment that many later remembered with quiet disbelief. A column of U.S. Army vehicles rumbled down the perimeter road. Jeeps, ambulances, supply trucks. Dust lifted behind them in rhythmic waves. But it wasn't the engines, the military markings, or the pace of the convoy that drew the prisoners' eyes. It was the drivers. Several were women, not nurses, not secretaries, not auxiliaries confined to side rooms or clerical tables. They were uniformed members of the Women's Army Corps, driving military vehicles with practiced confidence, shifting gears with ease, and managing a convoy that fed the logistical operations of the entire district. Some wore helmets, some wore soft caps. All bore the insignia of official U.S. Army service. For the female POWs, this sight struck harder than the barbed wire surrounding them. In Germany, a woman handling a military truck in wartime conditions was unthinkable. In Italy and Japan, such an idea bordered on the absurd. Yet here, far from Europe, it unfolded in plain daylight. The realization spread through the group almost physically, the understanding that this nation had mobilized not only its manpower, but its woman power, and that its capacity to wage total war extended far beyond what they had been taught to expect. This moment did not end with the passing convoy. It opened the door to a series of encounters that would challenge their assumptions even further. In the weeks that followed, the significance of that first convoy became clearer. Every morning, long before sunrise, engines coughed to life outside the wire. Trucks lined up in rows, their silhouettes framed against floodlights and low winter clouds. Female POWs, standing in formation for roll call, watched the routine unfold day after day. And each day carried the same revelation. Many of the drivers were women, not visitors, not exceptions, but integral parts of the camp's logistical rhythm. They watched WAC drivers reverse heavy trucks into loading bays with precision. They saw women carrying clipboards, taking inventory, signing transport logs, and directing crates of medical supplies. They noticed that male soldiers treated them not as novelties, but as colleagues, a detail that challenged the prisoners as much as anything else. For some POWs, particularly those who had served in tightly controlled German auxiliary roles, these moments carried a quiet sting. They recalled recruitment speeches promising honor through obedience, strength through restraint, and patriotic womanhood through domestic service. Yet here, thousands of miles away, women their age, some younger, were entrusted with machines that powered vast military operations. American officers later noted this silent astonishment. Reports from POW camp staff described moments when female prisoners paused their assigned tasks, simply to watch a U.S. woman maneuver a vehicle or supervise a shipment. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The contrast spoke for itself. Outside the camps, the pattern was the same. Across the United States, WAC drivers operated on Army posts, hospitals, airfields, and supply centers. In Europe, WAC units drove jeeps for headquarters staff, transported messages, and supported medical operations. Although they never served as tank crews in combat, American women did work around armored vehicles at depots and training sites, guiding them onto rail cars or moving them short distances. Another sight that startled captured Axis personnel who expected such roles to belong exclusively to men. By early 1945, many POWs had come to understand the deeper truth behind what they were witnessing. America's strength in the war did not rest solely on its weapons or armies, but on its ability to mobilize its entire society, breaking old boundaries in the process. This realization would echo long after the war ended, shaping the way many former prisoners remembered their time behind the wire. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the guns fell silent, but for those held in American POW camps, the end of the war did not bring immediate release. Repatriation unfolded slowly, bound by logistics, political uncertainty, and the grim work of rebuilding shattered nations. For the female prisoners, months passed in steady routines, camp labor, inspections, meals, and long hours of waiting for transport orders. Yet throughout this period, the presence of American women in uniform remained a daily reminder of a world far larger than the one they had known. By the summer and autumn of 1945, reports were circulating among prisoners about the scale of women's wartime contributions in the United States. They learned that hundreds of thousands had served in military branches as drivers, mechanics, telephone operators, and administrative specialists. Millions more had worked in war industries, producing aircraft, ships, trucks, and ammunition. For POWs raised on strict doctrines of gender hierarchy, this information carried both shock and quiet fascination. Some American camp personnel later noted that female prisoners frequently studied the routines of WAC drivers and clerks with an intensity that bordered on academic. They observed how the system functioned, how orders were given, how responsibilities were shared, how respect between male and female soldiers appeared natural, not forced. What they witnessed contradicted much of the propaganda they had absorbed before capture. When repatriation finally began, many female POWs traveled back to a Germany devastated by bombings, shortages, and political collapse. Their homes had changed, their society had fractured, but their memories of the American women they had seen remained intact. Those impressions, quietly carried in memory, stood in contrast to the rigid roles their own regimes had demanded before and during the war. These impressions did not end their suffering, nor did they erase what the war had taken from them. But they planted seeds, small personal recognitions that the world's ideas about who could serve, who could drive, who could lead, were not fixed. They could shift, just as the war had shifted everything else. As former POWs returned home through the late 1940s, they carried with them not only the hardships of captivity, but also a set of observations that quietly contrasted with the society awaiting them. In post-war Germany, women were immediately thrust into the urgent work of survival, clearing rubble, repairing homes, rebuilding communities. They became known as Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, a symbol of resilience in a country broken by defeat. Yet these responsibilities, though heavy, did not come with the authority or recognition they had seen American women exercise in uniform. Some returning prisoners entered clerical jobs or nursing roles similar to those they held before the war. Others struggled to find any employment at all. The political restructuring of Germany brought new ideas about citizenship and equality, but change moved slowly. For many women, true professional autonomy would take decades to arrive. Still, a number of former auxiliaries quietly acknowledged that the images they had witnessed in captivity, American women driving military trucks, maintaining vehicles, and overseeing logistical hubs, lingered in their minds as examples of what was possible when a society entrusted women with responsibility. In the broader post-war world, women's participation in the U.S. war effort became a cornerstone of later movements for equal rights. Though many American women were pressured to return to domestic life in 1945, the memory of their wartime service remained public and recorded. Former WWII members joined veterans organizations, shaped workplaces, and became influential voices in the evolving discourse on women's rights. Their wartime contributions helped lay the groundwork for social shifts in the 1950s and 1960s, long after the uniforms were folded away. For the nations defeated in the war, Reconstruction eventually brought its own reforms. Education expanded, new opportunities emerged, and generations grew up with a wider understanding of what women could achieve. The war had not been fought to redefine gender roles, Yet the total mobilization it demanded had exposed millions, prisoners and civilians alike, to realities that contradicted the strict ideologies of the past. And in the memories of those women who once stood behind the wire, the sight of American women at the wheel remained a lasting reminder that strength in war had many forms, some of them entirely unexpected. The Second World War reshaped nations through fire, loss, and unimaginable sacrifice. Yet among its countless transformations, the quiet revolution witnessed in the shadows of POW camps carried its own significance. For the female prisoners who watched American women drive trucks, manage convoys, and support vast military operations, the experience revealed a truth their governments had never admitted. Strength was not the property of one gender, nor was service confined to old assumptions. In a conflict defined by tanks, fleets, and armies of millions, it was often the smaller, human moments that left the deepest marks. A uniformed woman gripping a steering wheel, a convoy rolling across a camp road, a glance exchanged across a line of barbed wire. These scenes did not change the course of battles, but they altered the way individuals understood the world and their place within it. The war ended, the camps emptied, and lives scattered across continents. But those memories endured. They became quiet threads woven into the post-war years, reminders that societies could change, that roles could expand, and that the boundaries of possibility were far wider than wartime propaganda ever allowed. History records nations. Memory preserves moments, and sometimes a single moment is enough to shift how a life and a world can be imagined.